In a world that's changing really rapidly, where you don't have stability, stability is actually the new risk, because those things that are perceived as stable really aren't as stable. So the opportunities that you thought were risky to pursue the things that you cared about relatively are not that risky.
This is Dr. Rob Harter with the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast, Making Your World Better. What does it take to be an effective nonprofit leader today? What are the biggest challenges? What are the biggest obstacles? How should nonprofits fundraise in an economy that is constantly changing? All of these reasons combined led me to start this show. And it's my hope that through this series, people can learn not only what it takes to be an effective nonprofit organization, but to hear from effective leaders who are successfully making a positive impact in their communities. We hope you enjoy the show, as together we hear how they are making their world better.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast with Rob Harter. I'm Alex Budak. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a listener just like you. We're all on a leadership journey looking for ways to learn and grow. Each week, I look forward to hearing Rob's latest discussion with his guests. I invite you to join us and subscribe. Thanks for listening. Now here's Rob.
Welcome back, everybody, to the show. I'm Rob Harter, your host. Well, today's conversation will cover a lot of ground, partly because my guest has such a wide range of experience in several sectors, actually, you'll find out. And we'll talk about how the workplace, for example, is changing today, specifically how the emerging generations now coming into the workplace are seeking significance and impact, not just compensation and prestige. Now, but one of the nuggets that I really took away from my conversation was when we were talking about innovation. And he shares this really cool concept. And here's what it is. Being innovative inherently means you need to take risks. Now, he's coming from the venture capital world, right? So he's all about taking risks. Now, taking risk in the social impact sector is not always valued or applauded. If you remember my conversation with Dan Pallotta a couple of months ago, he talks about this, that we really are lacking in the innovation side because it's not honored. It's not applauded. In fact, sometimes quite the opposite. You may get penalized for taking risks that don't work out. But as my guest rightly points out, failure is not losing, failure is stagnation. And we in the social impact sector, I think, just can get much better at innovation and being willing to take more risks. And again, I'm not talking about risking everything or being on a constant binge of risking your nonprofit at every turn, but having an intentional, a thoughtful process of taking a risk that has a high probability of success. Now, that's something we can get better at in the nonprofit world. And as our world is constantly changing and everyone around us is getting more innovative and the technology is getting more innovative, we need to keep up, in my mind, in the social impact sector to become more innovative ourselves. And so my guest today is Arun Gupta. He is currently the CEO of the NobleReach Foundation, but he's also a venture capitalist, a lecturer at Stanford University. He's an adjunct entrepreneurship professor at Georgetown University, and he's a best-selling author of the most recent book, The Mission Generation. There'll be a lot in my show notes today for this conversation because he talks about a lot of things that are worth following up on. But again, as always, thanks so much for tuning in. Now to my interview with Arun. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business. Welcome, everybody, to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. I'm so glad to have Arun Gupta here with us on the show. Arun, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Rob.
Well, I always like to start each episode giving my guests an opportunity to talk a bit about their story. So maybe you could just start off just giving us a bit about your story, your journey of how you got to where you are today.
Well, Rob, I grew up in the DC area. This has been home for me. My dad was in the Navy for 40 plus years. So, public service has been in our family from my childhood. My professional career was also here in DC, was in venture capital. I was at Carlyle and then Columbia Capital, founded by Mark Lerner. And, there sort of saw the power of entrepreneurship and innovation and technology to really build meaningful businesses. And then after my venture capital days, I started teaching. I was teaching at Georgetown. I was teaching at Stanford, Washington. And, while I was teaching, I really saw the class I was teaching at Stanford was called Valley Meets Mission. How do you take the entrepreneurial spirit of the Valley and not waste it on Candy Crush 3.0, but go solve big problems that matter and that have societal value, but doing it in a for-profit way. And, I found that the message, to the students felt like it was unique, but it also resonated. And I was sharing some of the observations with someone at Georgetown, and they were like, have you thought about writing a book? which I was, the furthest from anything I was thinking about. And we went down a path to just explore what that would look like and talk to folks. In short, ended up writing a book called Venture Meets Mission, which ended up being a national bestseller, and then have raised a foundation where we have close to $500 million endowment now called NobleReach. And a lot of it is to take what we wrote about, which is, hey, in this country, our superpowers are that we create talent better than anywhere else in the world, and we innovate better than anywhere else in the world. And but what we haven't done is really modernize the infrastructure to connect our best tech talent, especially, and our best innovators to want to collaborate with government to solve problems at scale. And so how do we do that? And that's what we're focused on at NobleReach, especially on the talent side, and trying to inspire this next generation across all career stages to be thinking about collaborating and rekindling the spirit of national service in collaboration with government, both federal, state, and local. So that's what we're doing today. But that's the arc of how I got here, and probably the lens of which I think about some of these problems from.
Yeah. Well, it is. You have a lot of experience. You're involved, and you've been involved in so many different areas. Thanks for giving just a quick summary, and then we'll talk a little bit more about NobleReach specifically. But with the fact that you are a leader in emerging technology, entrepreneurship, education, public policy, and venture finance, as you mentioned, and you're also an author. We're going to talk a bit about your most recent book called The Mission Generation. So through your current work, one of the questions I want to start with is when it comes to trend lines in today's marketplace, and particularly we'll start with global events. And the big one, of course, is the pandemic a few years ago, its aftermath, and how people have responded since then in the workplace. You have written a lot about this, that people really are seeking for more purpose in their lives. So maybe we can start there. Talk about some of the things you found that we kind of globally as a world, really, not just a country, went through this major pandemic, which then reshaped, reprioritized what we're focused on. What have you seen? How does this play out in the marketplace?
Yeah, Rob. So, look, I come at it from the perspective of, I started teaching right before the pandemic and then was teaching through the pandemic. And so I say that because I saw a very big difference in how my own students were thinking about the world, but thinking about their careers and where they fit into the world. And, I think the pandemic brought a few things to them. One, a level of uncertainty that they, were not expected. The black swan kind of hit. Second, though, a pause, which allowed them to be reflective and think about, what was it that they wanted to do? And, third, soon after, we started seeing, geopolitical conflict. So we had, instances in Ukraine, obviously, and events there. We started seeing environmental conflict, around us. Great power competition started to emerge. And, you keep going, and then soon thereafter, you've got AI. And I say all of that because I think, the pandemic was the start of this sense of disruption and creative uneasiness. But I think at the core, when we look back on it, that's a lot to have happened in over a 5-year span. And I think when that happens, one of the things that we're seeing was that, pre-pandemic, the ground felt pretty stable, right? And so I felt like my students were all focused on themselves, on what am I going to go do? And, they were kind of funneling themselves into pathways. And as the ground gets rocky, I think what happens is, we reach out to others for stability. And as you reach out to others for stability, it's largely also a metaphor for, looking to be part of something bigger than. You want to have a bigger meaning in what you're doing. And I could see that in the kind of questions students were asking. And that was really the impetus around, what we're doing at NobleReach, but also then wanting to write this second book called The Mission Generation, because I feel like what I was starting to see is this centering theme. Pre-pandemic, I felt, where folks was focused on who I work for, the prestige marker, or what I'm doing, also a prestige or a financial marker. And, where we are today and what we're seeing through our programs are people are asking, though, why am I doing what I'm doing, right? And the why is a purpose marker. And I think, and then purpose and mission, as a result, I think are becoming in a more important question. And partially because in a world that's changing as rapidly as it is, I think mission and purpose are going to be the only things that are constant and are stabilizing. And so I think, we're returning to asking those questions in a meaningful way.
Now, well said. And I want to get to that title that you picked, Mission Generation, for your latest book. Talk about that a little bit more about how it reflects our current workforce trends. It's more than just a title. It's really a concept that you've been working on. You've already touched on it a little bit more. Talk a bit more about that. Is this located more with one generation? Is it with kind of the multiple generations that are coming up? Tell me more about that, what you found in your research.
Yeah. So what we saw in our research and started with our, just anecdotally with the folks we were dealing with, we could feel this with the early career folks, as I was just talking to about. But then as we talked to mid-career and later career folks, they were struggling with the same question of purpose, just in a different context. So they're asking the same questions. It was just applied differently. The way you apply it when you're 22 to 35 and maybe single and have no family obligations may be different, the questions you're asking, but at the same time, folks that, now had been working for 15 years are asking the same questions. Is this it? Is there more to it? What am I doing? Why does it matter? And then you get to the late career folks and they're at a different part of their career and they're asking the same questions. And part of it is because I think our systems over time, look, we talk about this in the book, but biologically, we are wired to seek security and stability, because we want to minimize risk. There's studies that show that people will pick security and stability over happiness. And as a result, I think our systems reinforce that and to find security and stability. Having said that, in a world that's changing really rapidly, where you don't have stability, we argue in the book that stability is actually the new risk, because those things that are perceived as stable really aren't as stable. And the opportunities of that you thought were risky to pursue the things that you cared about relatively are not that risky. And so I think what we define as the mission generation as a result of why it cuts across age groups is it's a posture. It's a posture of taking agency, of saying I'm not going to let the institution provide me meaning. I'm going to define what matters to me. And I'm going to combine my personal ambition and civic responsibility together over the course of my career. We created systems where careers were viewed as very linear. My dad had one job for 40 years. I would say I had one career for 30 years, multiple employers. Going forward, I think we're walking into a world where the scripts will say people are going to have 4 to 6 careers over their 60 years. And so that's a different kind of scaffolding that you need. And that's a builder mindset. Because I think that's the only way you can deal with uncertainty is by testing and learning, which is a very builder mindset. And that's what we define as a mission generation.
What's so interesting, you said that seeking stability is actually now a risk in today's world. I think that's fascinating to look at it that way. So let's talk a little bit more as we unpack that. What are some of the barriers you found when it comes to people that are trying to pursue meaningful and mission-driven careers today? They're bumping into barriers. What are those barriers and how can you remove them?
Yeah, so what we identify in the writing is, we classify them into 4 barriers. One is internal. It's probably your strongest one, fear of failure, perfectionism. Am I ready to do this? The second is more relational. The signals you get from your friends and family, which are all coming from a good place, but sometimes can, are you sure you really want to do that, son or daughter? That sounds risky. All of a sudden, if they start asking questions in that capacity, it can really inhibit your ability to kind of follow what you feel like is what you want to do. The third is societal. Will society value what I care about? And then the fourth is institutional. Depending on what path you pick, many institutions are this is a pathway forever. It's hard for you to leave. And so we identify those as, kind of at the core, the 4 barriers that I think that people really struggle with. And again, depending on, whether you're early, mid, and late careers, they manifest themselves in different ways, but the barriers themselves are constant. The questions you ask may be different. And then, we highlight a sense of how to overcome them using, both language with their compass capitals, but also, process with, as we talk about the mission flywheel. And at the core, at the mission flywheel, it's about experimentation, right? I think we've been trained again to look for clarity before we act. So let's figure out what we really care about, and then we'll go act. The problem with that is in a world that's changing really rapidly, by the time you feel like you got clarity, the conditions and the inputs you used to get that clarity have changed. And then you kind of go like, well, wait a second, this isn't what I thought it was. And so now you find yourself in this endless recursive loop. And so what we're saying is in the world we're in right now, you need to act, and those actions will bring you clarity. Those actions will be the signals that will let you say like, hey, I like this, I don't like that. I thought this was going to be great, but this doesn't feel right. And so that's a little bit of what we talk about around how that manifests itself. But we try to do this in a form where we're doing it through stories of people that have gone through the same kinds of questions, have struggled with the same dilemmas, and then how they walked through them and got to the other side. And largely because, I'm a big believer that if you can't see it, you can't be it. And so we're hoping that, through the stories that we have in the book of individuals, someone sees someone like them and they go, that person resonates with me. I don't know who that person may be. It'll depend on the reader. But if they can take away from that, if that person could do it, I can as well. That for us is a big win.
Okay, when you think about all those barriers that you listed, is there one or two that are more difficult to overcome based on your research, or is they're all equally difficult? It just depends on the person.
Look, I do think they depend on the individual. I think the hardest ones are always the ones that are internal, right? Like what's inside your head, because those are the most complicated. Those aren't voiced, and those aren't actually clear to people around you. And so, I think those are the hardest ones to work through. Having said that, those get influenced by the systems around you, right? Like what you think and how you think about yourself is influenced by the relational peer group you have around you, right? And how they view what you're doing. And so a big part of it that we talk about is, within the mission flywheel is forging allies. That also that it's not only about reframing what you want to do and running experiments, but forging allies that will support what you're doing, right? And what I mean by that is, it's one thing to someone when you tell someone you want to go do something and they go, "Why would you do that?" You immediately are put on the defensive, right? You're immediately like, "Oh, maybe I'm not doing the right thing," as opposed to finding an ally when you say, "Hey, look, I'm looking to do this." When I was writing a book, like that was a very vulnerable process for me. Take myself. And I had friends that were like, why would you write a book? Like, what are you going to get out of that? Like, what do you even know about that? Et cetera. And I was like, ooh, maybe I, you start questioning yourself. And then I had those few friends that were like, and when I would say it to them, were like, wow, that's amazing, Arun. You're going to give that a shot. Like they didn't know if it was going to succeed or not, but they were kind of there to support. Those words mean a lot, right? And to all of you that were part of that, thank you. Because, I think it's important for us to recognize that everyone's going through their vulnerability. And so finding those allies become incredibly important.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the internal, particularly when it comes to those internal questions, the doubts, the imposter syndrome, all these things that come from the inside. I found I'm a coach and a consultant, and I think when I'm particularly working with the individual coaching clients, that is one of the biggest barriers. You're absolutely right. It's most difficult to overcome. And then I love the idea of forging allies, because that's that person or that group of people that you can be vulnerable with, you can be honest with, that can help you work through those things that you won't tell everybody else because it is too vulnerable. So anyway, love that. That really makes sense to me. Okay, well, let's keep going into this process when it comes to the social impact sector. And the majority of my listeners, as far as I can tell, are in the social impact sector. It is the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. So this issue I'm going to ask about next, though, really applies. Doesn't matter if you're in the for-profit world or the nonprofit world. What role should organizations in general play when it comes to supporting this growing desire you're seeing for people wanting purpose and impact in their work? What would you say to both business leaders and nonprofit leaders?
No, I think, look, I don't think this is new that people have wanted this. I just think it's more top of mind now and front and center. There have been plenty written about purpose-driven organizations and things of that sort, but I think it comes down to not having it be kind of a slogan or something you do on the weekends. Like going your not-for-profit activity on the weekends is a nice thing to do for the team, but the more you can intertwine it into your business and the model of your business, I think it allows you to walk the walk of doing that. I also think, look, there's different ways to have impact, But I think people, can sometimes overthink that. Like, obviously, you want to have impact to society at large. But look, if you can impact your community in some way, shape, or form, with the jobs you're creating, that's meaningful, right? If you're an entrepreneur and you're building jobs and you're taking care of them, the culture you're building inside the workforce can have impact. Creating the intergenerational mentoring kind of programs. And I say intergenerational, it doesn't need to be older mentoring younger. Like, we've got programs here at NobleReach where we've got the younger folks mentoring the older ones on AI and technology, because you want to be able to show that, look, we all have something we can bring to the table, right? And it creates a level of impact and purpose when people feel like they have something to contribute. And so the big thing that we're trying to outline here is, it's the question about, like, what is it that you can contribute and what's the problem that you care about, and being able to surface that in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Well, you're getting this really critical, I would say, theme of this professional, personal ambition, but many people, most of us have, but also this idea of wanting a public impact. You want to make a difference. In the nonprofit world in general, you typically will join an organization that's mission-driven, right? They often call it the mission-driven sector. But again, business, you could be the same way. And as you're mentioning, that to integrate it is more important nowadays. So is there anything else you would talk about when it comes to really mirroring or bringing together, integrating this professional ambition on the one hand, but at the same time, really seeking that public impact? Because I think where maybe the rubber meets the road is when it comes to what's your ultimate goal. Are you trying to make money with your company, or are you really trying to make an impact? And that's difficult, right? To sometimes do both well. Nonprofits find the same issue, right? So talk about that. What have you found to be either companies, organizations that are doing this well, or maybe some principles you can share with my listeners of, here's some principles you can follow to help balance those two things at the same time?
Yeah, no, I think you're hitting at the core of, part of it is we don't have language for it. Because we do still talk about this in a very binary way. Either you can have impact or you can make money. And the truth is, neither by itself is sustainable. Meaning, we've had a script for so long where it was basically, you learn for the first third of your life, the second third, you go earn, monetize what you've learned and apply it. And then the last part of your life, you give back, you return. So, learn, earn, and return. And, I think what we're seeing in the world we're walking into, where there's a tectonic shift now happening with AI and everything, is learning is continuous. You can't, you're not learning for just the first third of your life and then saying, all right, I've learned this skill, I'm ready to go. And likewise, this idea of waiting till the end of your career for meaning is something that I think doesn't work anymore. People want to pull that up front. And so now it's about, I think, how do we braid careers that allow you to take those three aspects and earn and feel like you're doing something meaningful and that you're learning through the course of your career paths. And so I think, what we're seeing is that, we're going to start to see more nonlinear careers, right? People go into business, but then they may go, back into government or go into not-for-profit and bring some of those skills back in. Part of it also is to be able to show that these skills are transferable. And we don't do that right now, right? And part of it is because we talk about a career. But I think the world we're walking into, people are going to have 4 to 6 careers. We have a vignette in the book about, a gentleman named Nate Fick, who was a Marine HBS business school graduate, and then goes to a not-for-profit. And he would argue that, like, the not-for-profit, while, most of his peers were like, oh, wow, that's great, Nate. Like, in that kind of, amiable but yet condescending tone, but like, he would tell you that, going to a not-for-profit and learning how to lead without the tools of compensation and equity. Then when he went and, I had the privilege of working with him at a startup that was successful, Endgame, and then you give him the other tools, he's a better leader. And he's a better leader. He knows how to, and so, but we don't tell those stories right now. We don't celebrate people that have moved across sectors and have exceeded and have shared how those sectors have made them better in the other place. Likewise, look, I was been in the private sector my entire career, and this was my first time in the not-for-profit world. I see problems differently. And I think about scaling. I think about, building repeatable processes. And that's not good or bad. It's just different. And so if you can start to, engage more people to cross that, I think that can be deeply beneficial to how we unlock what I think is, trapped potential of talent in our society. Like we trap this talent into these sub silos and we don't give them crosswalks to go, really expand and unlock the potential that we really have.
We'll be right back. Are you looking for an easy and effective way to boost your nonprofit's donations? Well, look no further than DonorBox, the online fundraising platform that streamlines your fundraising efforts, maximizes donations, and simplifies giving for your supporters. With DonorBox, you can create beautiful donation forms, accept digital wallet payments, track donations, and send auto receipts. And the best part? There are no setup or monthly fees and no long-term contracts required. So what are you waiting for? Visit donorbox.org today to get started. That is www.donorbox.org. So interesting about, the idea of braiding careers and then also really honoring the fact of people going back and forth between a for-profit to nonprofit and back, right? I think those are really good things that you're right, we don't really talk about that or championing that very much. Well, you also said something interesting with your career specifically. You've done a lot with AI. You've done a lot, of course, in equity, raising money. You've done a lot with cybersecurity even. Talk about your perspective from all that for-profit experience, that business experience, when it comes to being now in more of a mission-driven organization. How has that impacted the way you view innovation? And the reason I mention this is because I think I've had people on the show talk about this, and I think it's probably true. It's not always true, but it's true with some nonprofits that we're slower to innovate. We're slower to take risks because we cannot bear the idea of people that were donating to our organization. If we, somehow lose money, so to speak, and we don't do what we said we were going to do because we were trying to innovate, that doesn't go so well with donors. And yet that holds nonprofits back from trying new things, taking risks. And that's what the entrepreneurial world and a lot of the world you've lived in, that's what you are good at. And that's what actually has created all these great products that we use. So talk about how do you mirror and marriage, maybe is a better word, the idea of innovation with a mission-driven organization?
Well, it's a great question, and I love it. And it doesn't extend to only not-for-profits. We see this in public service as well, where the proxy is taxpayer dollars, so you don't want to lose anything. And this has always been the biggest conundrum for me, right? Because, as a VC, I would always say, if I were measured like government or a not-for-profit, I would never raise another fund because I am measured on my best deal, right? And as long as I may have 8 failures, but 2 are wildly successful, I'll go raise plenty of other money and I'll raise another fund. Now, if I'm measured like government, if I do 9 things right, or like you said, a not-for-profit, and one thing doesn't work, I get measured by my worst opportunity, right? And so you're going to create a system then where people are then going to, resist making change. So 2 things I say to that. One, look, what I've seen is that's a leadership void. Like that needs to be communicated. Because as a leader, look, I tell my board, and I've told my organization, go experiment. I don't care if you fail. We just shouldn't fail repeatedly. But I also want to know what we learned from that failure. Because that learning will allow us to innovate and unlock something that we weren't even thinking about. And to me, that's about like a mindset that we need to inculcate, that losing isn't failure, settling is, right? And that mindset, I think, is wildly pervasive. And it's because we end up focusing on the downside and we don't focus on the upside. It's like, well, if I try that, it may not work. As a VC, we would always ask the question, but what if it did? What if it did work? Like if you tell me if it doesn't work, we're going to lose all our money. And if it does work, we make a 2x, maybe I don't do it. If you tell me if it doesn't work, we lose whatever we invested. But if it works, it's 100 times, I'll make that bet, right? So, I think a lot of this is not looking at it as success or failure, but looking at it as risk managers. Like, what's the risk? And so I think that's the perspective. And I've noticed that what you're getting at, that perspective of like, well, wait a second, what if it doesn't work? it's almost like it's like a pressure relief valve when you're able to tell people like, I don't care, like just try. It's a small enough experiment, and we're going to learn something from it. And I think it allows us to move, a lot faster. And look, the other thing I've learned in this process is it's never about the technology. It's never about the people. Never about the policy. It's always about the people. It's always about talent, right? And so if you get great talent around you and you give them the agency to experiment, great things happen. That was our number one thing in venture, is just find great teams in great markets, and then we'll see what happens from there.
Yeah. Well, powerful statement about failure is not losing, it's settling. I think that's a really powerful statement. And I do think, in general, the nonprofit community can get better at that. And having people like yourself maybe on the board or as an executive director saying, no, try it, take a risk. I think that's a really, really good encouragement, I think, for nonprofit leaders that are listening. Then for the rest of my listeners, if they're wanting to align a career, say, in finance or technology, but really mirror that and add national or social impact to what they do, what advice would you give them today from your experience and what you're seeing across the board with your research? Yeah, what advice would you pass on to my listeners?
Their skills are needed now more than ever across the public service, social sector, impact sector. Applying technology skills and finance skills, I'll just take public service right now. There's a dearth of it, right? We need, we had a stat, less than 7% of tech workers in government are under the age of 30. 7%. Think of the average age at any of the big tech firms, it's probably low 30s. We're 4 times as many over the age of 60. Yet, if we want to have a tech-forward government at the federal, state, and local level, we need these young folks coming in, right? And but we also recognize we can't be going to them and saying, hey, come here for 30 years, and then you'll have a big pension at the end of it. That message doesn't resonate anymore. It did at one time when we were in a more stable environment and people were wiring themselves for stability. But in the world we're in right now, we need to be able to tell them, come here for a couple of years, work on the most difficult, complex problems at a scale that you won't see anywhere else, or impacting your local community or state in a way that you won't be able to do anywhere else. And then go take what you've learned. And then, if you go to the private sector or go start your own thing, that's great. But that's how we build an ecosystem. We talk about that as a community of, at NobleReach that we're building, of dual citizens, public-private sector citizens. People that have a experience, in the civic responsibility world, but they're also like, look, personal ambition is important to me. And what we talk about is like, if we can get people to understand the language of both sectors, understand the cultures of both sectors, and then understand, have networks, trusted networks in both. That's how we rebuild trust in this country. And, look, right now we're in a trust deficit when it comes to those sectors. And, trust is, as much as AI is coming for a lot of things, trust is about people. And, it's why when we talk about, even how we think about, what assets personally will be valuable going forward, I think trust is a big one.
Yeah, I agree. Well, you've talked a lot about trends. Is there any other things you'd like to talk about when it comes to trends with mission-oriented careers, particularly in the area of technology, government, and venture finance? What are you seeing there in the future, trend lines anyway, when it comes to mission-oriented careers?
I'm going to be biased here because I think we're in the early innings of this. And I think this is also what personally and or institutionally I think we're passionate about, is that, I do think, we need to be creating the scaffolding to enable more people to go across sectors in these careers. And, we're trying to play a small part of that and stimulating the ecosystem for that. But I think that's both the challenge and the opportunity that we have ahead. And so the way we talk about it, as we head into our 250th this year as a country, is that 250 years ago, our founding fathers created a remarkable system of independence that has, allowed us to thrive in a way, that's unprecedented. But I think the opportunity and the challenge for us now, and what I call the mission generation, is how do we build a system of interdependence? And the interdependence, is important because, we're only going to succeed if we can lean on one another, and if we can move our talent ecosystem across different sectors so that we look at the same problem, but we have different lenses that we use on the problem. if we all have the same lens on a problem, we're not going to get true innovation. It's when we have different lenses looking at the problem that we can see something really powerful. And so, I think, a trend that we will see more of, especially with the anxiousness I think we all feel with all the change and uncertainty in the world right now, is the pendulum swinging back to folks wanting to be part communities and and be part of something bigger than themselves. And that doesn't mean that that's what they do for their entire career, but I think that's how they create a sustainable career for themselves and one that lasts, because we're entering a place now where people entering the workforce today probably are working for 60, 70 years. Not because they have to, but probably they'll want to because they're living longer. Think about all the life science breakthroughs that could happen between now and then. I'm already seeing it with my cohort, where, the idea late 50s, 60s, you start to slow down. Now people are like gearing back up again because they feel like they've got another 20 years in them. And when you think you've got another 5 years, you think one way. But when you think about 20 years, you have a different heuristic. And so I think a lot of that is still going to take time to sink in. But I think we're on the precipice of that creating a lot of change about how we think about careers.
That's so interesting. Well, again, fascinating conversation. For my listeners who listen and want to connect with you or find out a little bit more about your work and your book, where would you send them?
So thank you, Rob, for the book. Please go to themissiongeneration.com. You can find out more information about the book. It will be out early May. Look, folks, if whatever we're saying resonates, to think about pre-orders. Regarding NobleReach and the work that we talk about as well, NobleReach.org, to learn how to either, look to be a scholar, be a mentor, participate in our community in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Wow, good. Well, thanks again, Arun, for being on the show and just sharing your insights. It's a fascinating conversation. So much great material. And again, I encourage my listeners, check out the show notes. There's going to be lots of different links in the show notes and, of course, a link to the book. But Arun, you do so much and you've got such a wide range of experience. I think it's really helpful for leaders to tap into that and learn from you. So again, thanks for being on the show.
Rob, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Hey friends, well, I wanted you to know that this podcast can be found on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and wherever you listen to other podcasts. I also want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with others. This will actually help us get this great content out to more nonprofit leaders just like you. You can also join the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast community. Find other resources and interviews of past guests all on my website, nonprofitleadershippodcast.org. Well, thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep making your world better.
This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business.